Welcome to the debate. So imagine holding basically a blank check for absolute cosmic authority.
Right, you can pick whatever title you want.
Exactly. You could claim to be king. You could claim, Messiah. You could claim son of God. Yet the most famous figure in history bypassed all of those grand royal titles for a phrase that, well, essentially translates to just a mortal guy.
Yeah, an ordinary human.
When Jesus of Nazareth spoke about himself, he reached for the phrase Son of Man over 80 times across the four Gospels. It is a striking numerical and psychological paradox. He avoided the prevailing titles of power and instead adopted a phrase that in first century Aramaic sounds like the plainest, humblest thing a person could possibly say.
Well, the tension in the historical record there is undeniably fascinating. I mean, the disciples are calling him Messiah, the crowds are shouting for the Son of David, and yet he actively suppresses those titles.
He constantly tells them to keep quiet about it.
Right. When he opens his own mouth to describe his identity, he uses this street-level idiom. But I approach this from a slightly different angle than you do. The prevailing assumption is that this was a veiled claim to supreme divine authority.
Which is what I will argue, yes.
And my challenge is this. If he intended to claim cosmic dominion, why did he use a phrase that functioned in everyday Aramaic as an utterly ordinary reference to a human being? If it was a claim to deity, why hide it in plain sight? And conversely, if it just meant immortal, why did the high priest eventually tear his robes and condemn him to death over it?
We have to resolve that tension by looking at the apocalyptic literature of the period. My position is that his use of Son of Man was not a sign of mere humility. And it wasn't just an ordinary idiom either. It was a loaded apocalyptic code.
A code?
Yes, a deliberate, calculated clash between the mortal dust of the book of Ezekiel and the heavenly cloud-riding figure of Daniel chapter 7. I mean, he was fusing the lowest possible human description with the highest possible divine vision into a single, unbreakable cipher.
But to understand how that code supposedly functioned, we really have to look at the raw linguistics first. When a first-century person heard the Hebrew Ben Adam or the Aramaic bar Anash, the plain meaning was incredibly grounded.
It literally means a son of man.
Right, it just means a human being, a mortal made of dust. There is nothing inherently mystical about it. The book of Numbers states clearly that God is not a son of man that he should lie.
True.
Job asks how a son of man could ever be righteous before God. It is the Hebrew Bible's standard way of identifying someone who breathes, bleeds, and eventually dies.
I definitely do not dispute the base translation there, but the theological weight of that phrase is anchored in how the prophets used it, particularly in the book of Ezekiel.
And honestly, Ezekiel is the perfect example of my point. God addresses his own prophet as Son of Man over 90 times in that scroll, and every single instance is utilized to emphasize human smallness, mortality, and insignificance before God's overwhelming glory.
Because of the visions he's seeing?
Exactly. Look at the opening vision by the Chabar Canal. Ezekiel sees this immense storm, fire flashing, living creatures, wheels within wheels, a sapphire throne, and the blinding glory of the Lord. And Ezekiel falls on his face. Not a polite ceremonial bow, but the physical collapse of a body terrorized by the divine presence.
Right, he is completely undone.
And the very first thing the voice says to him is, "Son of man, stand on your feet." Before receiving a single instruction, Ezekiel is reminded of exactly what he is, animated dust. On the street level in first-century Judea, this was a flexible, ordinary idiom. It meant someone in my position, or, a man like me. It meant the exact opposite of God.
Look, I see why you emphasize the linguistic baseline, but I think that ignores the other massive textual reality of the first century. If Ezekiel were the only lens we had, your reading would be completely bulletproof.
But it's not the only lens.
Right.
There is another scroll sitting at the back of the synagogue, and it completely alters the diagnostic landscape of this title. In Daniel chapter 7, the phrase appears again, but in a context that should stop any careful reader cold. Daniel sees the throne room of heaven. The Ancient of Days takes his seat. Clothing white as snow, a river of fire flowing out, 10,000 times 10,000 attending him. And into that sovereign throne room, Daniel sees someone else arrive,
A figure he describes as one like a son of man.
Exactly. Coming with the clouds of heaven, he does not crawl in the dust like Ezekiel. In the Old Testament, riding the clouds is the specific exclusive mode of transportation reserved for Yahweh. You see it in the Psalms and in Isaiah. God rides the clouds. Yet here, this human-like figure approaches the Ancient of Days and is given an everlasting kingdom, dominion, and glory so that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him.
But the nature of that service is debated, isn't it?
Well, look at the Aramaic word used in Daniel 7 for the service owed to the Son of Man. It's pelech. It is a verb strictly reserved for the reverence and worship of deity. It is not the ordinary political fealty you give to Caesar or a Davidic king. This is a human figure receiving what only God receives in the room where only God sits. Jesus took these two completely contradictory weights, Ezekiel's dust and Daniel's clouds, and welded them together.
The problem with that reading, though, is that it assumes Daniel 7 was a clear, universally understood concept in the first century. And it just wasn't. If Jesus was trying to communicate this cosmic divine authority, choosing Daniel 7 was stepping into a semantic minefield.
How so?
Well, the early rabbis and Jewish scholars were fiercely debating this exact text. They argued over the identity of this cloud-riding figure. Was it an angel, like Michael? Was it merely a personification of the vindicated nation of Israel suffering under the Greek empires? Or was it a distinct, second individual sharing God's authority?
Which was a massive theological problem for them.
A huge problem. The idea of a human sharing God's throne room was so difficult to resolve with strict monotheism that it later sparked the two powers in heaven controversy. So my question is, why would a teacher trying to establish absolute authority anchor his entire identity to a title that was actively causing immense confusion in Jewish scholarship? Why not just use Messiah and make it clear?
Because the alternatives were lethal. We have to examine the strategic utility of the title within the geopolitical pressure cooker of Roman-occupied Judea. You ask why he didn't just use Messiah. The word Messiah was political, military gunpowder.
Because of the Roman occupation.
Right. In that specific cultural moment, Messiah meant a Davidic nationalist deliverer. The prevailing expectation was a general who was going to break Rome's neck, expel the legions, and put a physical throne back in Jerusalem. If Jesus walked into Galilee and openly declared, "I am the Messiah," he would have instantly catalyzed a violent, bloody rebellion. Rome would have marched in and slaughtered thousands, as they routinely did with other messianic claimants.
Okay, but claiming Son of God carried an entirely different but equally fatal set of risks.
Exactly. It was an immediate trigger for the religious establishment. The Sanhedrin was watching him meticulously. Claiming Son of God outright in a theological sense was an immediate trap for blasphemy charge. So Son of Man functioned as a dual-frequency broadcast.
A dual-frequency broadcast.
Yes.
To the Roman centurions and the casual listeners in the peasant crowds, it passed right over their heads. It sounded merely like a humble self-reference, a guy like me. But to the scribes, the Pharisees, and those who had memorized the scroll of Daniel, it was an electrifying, unmistakable claim to divine authority. It was a frequency only trained ears could hear, allowing him to conduct a public ministry without triggering immediate arrest by either Rome or the temple guard.
I understand the political necessity of avoiding Roman execution, but that creates a massive pedagogical problem. If only the elites hear the apocalyptic frequency and the peasants just hear a man like me, doesn't that defeat the purpose of a public revelation?
That's a fair question.
Furthermore, if you track his ministry on the ground, he actively confuses those frequencies. He doesn't just use the title in moments of triumph. If he is claiming the dominion of Daniel 7, why does he constantly use the title to highlight profound human vulnerability?
You're talking about the poverty verses.
Right. He says, "The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." That is the plainest, most mortal sentence you could say about a homeless itinerant rabbi. He says, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they call him a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors." He forces the title to carry the full weight of an ordinary man sitting at disreputable tables. How does that project the unapproachable glory of the Ancient of Days?
Because he forces the collision deliberately. He plays both notes in the exact same breath to redefine their expectations of authority. Yes, he talks about his poverty, but look at the mechanics of Mark chapter 2.
The healing of the paralytic.
Right.
A paralyzed man is lowered through the roof. Jesus looks at him and says, "Your sins are forgiven." The scribes sitting there immediately flag the theological violation. They reason in their hearts, who can forgive sins but God alone? They understand the jurisdiction of heaven.
And they know he doesn't have it in their eyes.
Exactly. And Jesus, perceiving their thoughts, says, "So that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," and then he heals the man. He leverages this ordinary-sounding street idiom to exercise an exclusive prerogative of Yahweh.
And he applies the same mechanism to the Sabbath regulations.
He does. He walks through the grain fields, his disciples are picking heads of grain, and the Pharisees challenge the legality of their actions under Sabbath law. Jesus responds by declaring, "The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath," which is a staggering claim.
He claims absolute jurisdiction over an institution that Genesis states God himself established at creation, long before the nation of Israel or the law of Moses even existed. He asserts divine authority over time and law itself, all while utilizing a title that sounds like just a guy.
Okay, but even if we accept that he is injecting divine prerogatives into the title, the synthesis completely breaks down when we look at his predictions of the crucifixion. I mean, this is where the linguistic Trojan horse becomes almost absurd.
How so?
Jesus repeatedly predicts his own execution, stating, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected and be killed." If he had said, "The Messiah must suffer," the semantic structure of first-century Judaism would have collapsed. A Messiah does not bleed at the hands of pagans. A Messiah slaughters pagans. The phrase suffering Messiah was virtually an oxymoron.
Right, it was cognitively impossible for them to process.
Which is exactly why Peter rebukes him for saying it. But linguistically, a son of man can suffer. A son of man is Ezekiel's dust. Men bleed. Men die at the hands of the state. He uses the phrase because it is the only grammatical container that can hold the concept of execution. He says, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Exactly.
But you cannot have it both ways. You cannot claim that the title evokes the invincible, cloud-riding deity of Daniel 7, who receives the worship of all nations, and simultaneously use it to describe a vulnerable servant who gets crushed by the Roman legal system. I mean, the two concepts repel each other.
But that tension, the sovereign who receives global worship and the servant who bleeds, that tension brings us to the absolute climax of this historical investigation. We have to look at the night trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, recorded in Mark 14 and Matthew 26.
The trial is where all of this comes to a head.
Yes, the scene mechanics here are vital for understanding how the code is finally broken. Jesus is bound. He has been arrested in the dark of Gethsemane, dragged before a religious court without an official daylight trial.
Which in itself violated several protocols of Jewish jurisprudence.
Absolutely. He is exhausted, abandoned by his followers, and has already been physically struck. Legally and visually, in that room, he is the absolute embodiment of Ezekiel's dust. He is the lowest, most powerless person present, entirely at the mercy of the high court.
Well, the legal mechanics of that trial are highly scrutinized by historians for good reason. The prosecution is failing, the false witnesses cannot get their testimonies to align, and Jewish law requires 2 concurring witnesses for a capital conviction. Caiaphas is losing control of his own court.
He's desperate.
Right, he needs the prisoner to incriminate himself. So the high priest stands up, steps into the center, and demands a direct, unambiguous answer under oath. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" Now, up until this exact moment, Jesus has utilized the Son of Man code to deflect, to maintain that dual frequency, and to avoid premature arrest. But here, facing imminent execution, he abandons the secrecy.
Because the earthly ministry is finished, the timeline is complete, and it is time to force the verdict. Jesus answers, "I am." No parables, no rhetorical questions thrown back at them. But notice the brilliance of the construction here. He does not stop at accepting the title Messiah. He immediately drops the Daniel 7 code into the open air of the courtroom. He says, "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven."
But look at what happens next. The high priest tears his robes and declares blasphemy. Now, many historians argue that Caiaphas was not reacting to a theological claim of divine equality, but to a massive political threat.
A political threat?
Yeah. By claiming he would sit at the right hand of power, Jesus was essentially telling the Sanhedrin that their authority was void and that he was the true judge of Israel. The torn robes could simply be the reaction of a powerful religious leader whose institutional authority has just been directly challenged by a peasant. We do not have to read a cosmic Trinitarian claim into this. It functions perfectly well as a radical, subversive threat to the temple establishment.
I see the logic. But that interpretation fails to account for the strict legal definition of blasphemy in the Mishnah. Tractate Sanhedrin explicitly states that a blasphemer is not culpable unless he explicitly pronounces the divine name, the tetragrammaton.
Right, the actual name of God.
Yes, challenging the high priest's authority was dangerous, certainly, but it was not formal blasphemy punishable by death. Jesus actually circumvents the technicality of pronouncing the name by using a common Jewish circumlocution, referring to God as power, or gevura. He says the right hand of power. Yet, despite avoiding the pronunciation of the name, Caiaphas still tears his robes. Culturally and legally, tearing your garments in a judicial setting was a mandatory act strictly reserved for hearing irreparable, undeniable blasphemy against God himself.
Okay, so what specifically crossed the legal line into blasphemy if he didn't pronounce the name?
The fusion of the text. Jesus takes Psalm 110, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand," and welds it to Daniel 7, "coming with the clouds of heaven." He takes the two most exalted texts in the Hebrew Bible regarding divine authority and applies them to himself while standing in chains. He claims to be the cloud-riding figure who shares the very throne of God Almighty.
He claims the second throne.
Yes, he is claiming the second throne in heaven. Every single scribe in that room knew exactly what coming with the clouds meant. He wasn't just threatening their temple, he was claiming to be the God who owned the temple. And he does this from the position of a bruised, defenseless prisoner.
The irony is just staggering. I mean, the court that is judging him is told that they are actually the ones on trial, and the man bleeding on the floor is their cosmic judge. But how do we reconcile the timeline here?
What do you mean?
He says, "You will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds." If he is about to be executed, when is this cloud riding supposed to happen? Was it a threat about an apocalyptic future event that just failed to materialize?
Not at all. We have to look closely at the linguistics of the Greek text in Mark's Gospel. The Gospel writers use a specific present participle for the word coming. It indicates a continuous, ongoing motion. It isn't that the Son of Man is going to simply show up someday in the distant future to take revenge.
So it's happening right then?
Exactly. The verb implies a motion that is already underway. When Jesus speaks those words to Caiaphas, he is stating that the cross and the throne are not two separate events bolted together after the fact. They are one continuous motion of the exact same figure. The humiliation and the exaltation are the same process. He is moving toward the throne of the Ancient of Days by walking toward the Roman cross.
Which fundamentally rewrites the definition of divine power. It means the claim to dominion was never suspended during his earthly suffering. The bound wrists didn't negate the heavenly authority, they were the precise mechanism of it. When you step back and look at the whole picture, from the Chabar Canal in Ezekiel to the throne room in Daniel, and finally to the floor of the Sanhedrin, Son of Man emerges as the only title in the entire historical lexicon that could contain this specific contradiction.
It is completely unique.
It holds a man who wept at a grave, slept in a boat, and bled on a piece of wood, alongside a figure who receives the eternal, divine worship of all nations.
A title like Messiah promises a king, but it provides no theological framework for the dust of humanity. It leaves absolutely no room for weakness. A title like Son of God claims absolute divinity, but to a first-century mind it says nothing about a body that gets tired or hungry or humiliated. Only Son of Man refuses to let the listener split the difference. It demands that you hold the infinite and the infinitesimal in the exact same breath.
The genius of the self-designation is that it bridges the ultimate philosophical gap. You have the reality of human suffering, the moments of being face down in the dirt, painfully aware of physical fragility and a lack of control, exactly like Ezekiel.
Right.
Shaken, precisely because that entity has already absorbed the worst of human frailty. It forces us to confront an authority that is both empathetic enough to bleed and powerful enough to judge.
It is a diagnostic landscape of identity that remains, honestly, deeply complex. Jesus did not give his followers, or his enemies, a simple binary title. He gave them a paradox that required them to rethink everything they knew about power and proximity. He bypassed the crown, picked up the dust, and cleaned the clouds. Returning to the Gospels with this Daniel 7 code in mind fundamentally changes how you read the text. The next time you see Jesus use that phrase, over 80 times, you are no longer just seeing a humble carpenter speaking in idioms. You are seeing a deliberate fusion of heaven and earth, hiding the most massive claim in the universe inside 3 ordinary words. We will leave you to examine the texts and wrestle with that image for yourselves.